Well, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is an honor to be in the great state of Minnesota. It's equally an honor to be introduced by a dear friend, Drew Brooks. And I also want to just thank for a moment the courage of Pastor Ed Treat. You may know his story. If you don't, I highly suggest that you get to know Pastor Treat. He stepped out on faith to give his all to this significant organization. And Pastor Treat, I think that that's worth a round of applause. Can y'all clap for Pastor Treat and his family? It takes a lot of courage to do what he's doing. And to the board members who are here, to all of the sponsors and those who are concerned about the issues that we are here to talk about over the next couple days, I want to thank you. Because these issues are significant and these issues can challenge one's soul. And as Drew Brooks spoke of, I have a lot packed into the title. Each one of those subject matters or conceptual frameworks could take a lifetime. But I am trying to unpack those things in just a little while. I come from a family who would always say, boy, make it plain. If you cannot say what you need to say, you shouldn't be saying it at all. So true to my family's lineage, I have a lot packed into this short time. Let me also thank the good reverend who spoke earlier, who was honest and transparent about her situation. Those of you who are in recovery, you know that one of the first things you must do is to admit that you have a problem. You also must admit when you are trying to transition from one place to another. And for her to talk about what her family went through, I would also suggest it's also part of her purpose. Because oftentimes God will place us in a predicament to where our knees are buckled so that we can recognize why we're here. And if you think about what she's doing and where God has positioned her, I think we ought to thank President Biden and those others who have sought fit to give her the nomination for the role that she's playing. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can do one to the other when two or more are gathered in the name of Almighty God. I can say God at a faith conference, right? This is a addiction and faith. I have to be careful in Louisiana because in my role as an appointing authority and government official, I have to preface what I say. But when you walk the walk and talk the talk, you don't have to always say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can tell by the actions more than anything. But again, for a little while, I'd like to speak with you from the subject matter, spiritual determinants of health and trauma and addiction, a case for health equity and racial reconciliation. As I would customarily do on a Sunday or whenever I give a talk, I like to set the framework by which I'm coming from. And I know that in the Health and Human Services arena, spiritual determinants of health is one of those, what is that? We hear a lot about the political determinants of health, the social determinants of health, but what about the spiritual determinants of health? And God has burdened my soul with the concept of spiritual determinants of health. Because when you think about the world, no matter what time period, you will find man's inhumanity to man. If you go to the African continent, you'll find it. If you go to Europe, you'll find it. If you go to South America, you'll find it. What is it about humanity that makes us do things to another human being? I submit to you that there's a spiritual determinant to why we do what we do. Where can it be found? Well, I'm glad you asked. It can be found in the book of Genesis. But before I get to that very specific point in the book of Genesis, I want to talk about environment, creation. God saw fit to create from himself and said, let there be. He created the heavens and the earth. Said scientifically, he created ecosystems. He created the sea. He created the plant life. He created every species there is, and passed a treat including opioids or the poppy plant. He created all kinds of seed-bearing fruit. And then he said, let's make man in our image and our likeness. But before he did that, he created. He created a sense of homeostasis between the environment that he created, from the heavens to the earth and within subatomical structures. Everything is related to every other thing in God's creation. That's what he created, and he said that it was good. Then he created man in his image and likeness, and saw fit that man should not be alone, and created a suitable helpmate. He also created the Garden of Eden and placed man in that environment. Notice I said he first created ecosystems. And then he created a special place within that ecosystem called Eden. And then he took what he created and placed him there and gave him a set of instructions for him to work and not to eat of certain things. And he gave Adam the task of naming and creating and facilitating, and one was good. But he told Adam to do one thing, and that was not to eat from the tree of knowledge, because if he did, he would surely die. What is that tree of knowledge of good and evil? I submit to you, it is a recognition that one has a different way of reasoning and understanding the world. But as long as Adam remained in that posture where he was obedient to God's will, he knew no sin, and his wife knew no sin, and they were one with God's creation. But how many know that when you are dwelling and soldiering in harmony, there's always something that will creep and crawl to try to get you to work against what you know to be true, whether that's thoughts of in your own mind or thoughts of another. You all know the story. You had a snake that approached Eve and asked her a couple of questions, and she misunderstood what Adam said. How many know? Because Eve wasn't around when God gave Adam instructions. So it must have been then that there was miscommunication between Adam and his wife. That's important because in order for two to be on one accord, they must be in agreement and they must understand specifically what to do and what not to do. And in this instance, she was confused and she took and bit, and then she handed some, according to the word of God, to Adam. And then he bit. And what happened when their eyes became open? The first thing they did was started to cover. Then they started hiding. And then they became hypersensitive to God walking through the cool. And God said, Adam, where are you? And Adam started hiding. Think about the addicts that you know. Hiding. Shameful. Don't want people to know what's going on with you. And then God said to Adam, who told you that you were naked? And what did Adam do? He blamed his wife. God went to Eve, and who did she blame? She blamed the snake. And what did the snake do? You know the story. And as a consequence from that sin, they became aware of all the things that God had shielded them from. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how sin entered the world. But look at the consequences of that sin. God punished Adam. God punished Eve. God punished the snake. And God put Adam and Eve out of his presence, out of his ecosystem, out of Eden, where harmony was, oneness with God was. And now all of a sudden, there's a breach. It would be like if you think about the person that is the closest to you, and you find out after this night is over that you'll never see them again, with no explanation. How would you feel? If you lost the thing that's closest to you, how would you feel? If God created you, you knew no sin. He created the optimal environment for you. And all of a sudden, you were punished and put out of his presence. It was so significant that God had to send his only begotten son to reclaim a sin-sick world. That's how significant the original breach was. That's the context for the spiritual determinants of health and trauma. Well, you might be saying, well, what are some of the ramifications of that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Adam and Eve had a son. The first one was named Cain. The second was named Abel. What did Cain do to Abel? Cain killed Abel. But before he killed his brother, why did he do it? It's because he was jealous. He wanted God to favor him. And because God didn't show favor on him, he couldn't take it. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'm talking about epigenetics of health. I'm talking about generational trauma from the original sin of Adam and Eve, violating God's decree. It will not only affect you, ladies and gentlemen, it'll affect your children and your children's children. You might say, well, really? Yes. How many know that Cain was terrified with the notion that others would kill him? Now, he killed his brother, and he was concerned about others killing him. And God made him a wanderer, but he marked him so that nobody would kill him. But if you keep on reading a little bit here, you'll find that his great-great-great-grandchild, Lamech, also killed a man and bragged about how his great-great-grandfather killed a man. And there will be 70 times 7 for anybody who tried to avenge what he had done. And I can go on and on and on and on, but I think you got the point. There is a spiritual determinant to health. And trauma is one of those things that human beings perpetuate onto one another. Because I share with you, no matter where you find human beings, you'll find some of the best of us, and you'll also find some of the worst of us. You might be saying, well, okay, well, now that I understand the context of the spiritual determinants of trauma and health, what does that have to do with me in America? Everything. And what is that everything? I'll submit to you that we are in Minnesota. I'd like to tell you about what happened in Minnesota more than one time. It set off not only across our nation, but our world, a conversation about all manner of things. But I will submit to you that before America became America, you had issues on the continent of Africa. You had issues in Europe. Slavery was not a new phenomenon. It was known in every country in the world. Europeans enslaved other Europeans. You have the serfs and others and other indentures. You had the Arabs enslaving Africans before the transatlantic slave trade. Everywhere you find people, you'll find good and you'll find bad. Why did I mention Africa and the slavery there and the importation of slaves being sold throughout the world, because every other nation did likewise. Because everywhere you find human beings, you'll find trauma, and you will find the ramifications of that trauma. Well, what does that have to do with America? Again, I'm glad you asked. And I'm going through a lot of history here because I have to, because I don't have a lot of time. But suffice it to say, what was happening in Europe during the Middle Ages? What did the British do to the Irish? What were people doing to the Slovakians, where the name slave comes from? What did the Romans do? What did the Chinese do? What did indigenous communities do? What did Africans do? They sold people that they went to war with. And why? For money and for materials and safety and security. All nations did it. So if you think about what the Portuguese did, and if you think about what the Dutch did, if you think about what the Spanish did after the fall of the Roman Empire, they were looking for new territories to colonize. A lot went on in terms of what nations did, but they were also looking for expansion and greed and material wealth. They'd already known the transportation of different types of people who were captive. Make a long story short, there's been a lot said about 1619. Critical race theory was factual in America in terms of its history. And what you'll find is that in America, before it became the United States of America, you had traumatized people who made deals with other traumatized people and the elite to come to America. Because remember, you had the British who essentially enslaved his own. And then some of those individuals were also forced to flee to America or the new colony for opportunities that they didn't have in their homeland. And they were abused in their homeland and when they got to their colonies. The same for the Africans who were sold by other Africans and who were purchased by the Portuguese and the British and the Dutch. You had all these folks in the Virginia colony interacting with one to the other based on greed of the home country. And so much so that you had these individuals who got tired of being left out of the economic prosperity that the English crown and its investors had based on the new colony. And I submit to you that each of you ought to Google Bacon's Rebellion to find out what indentured whites did with free and black or enslaved blacks and indigenous populations, and how they fought against the elites in Virginia. And after about a year, the British Crown crushed that situation. And then what happened was you had a passage of laws. And what they did was they made white people white. Before, they were the Irish, they were the British, they were Scotch, they were Native, they were Igbo, they were all of their tribal names. But to prevent a rising up, the Crown and the House of Burgess made white people white for the first time and made them separate and apart and different from the enslaved. And they instituted chattel slavery. That's the difference between all the other slavery and the American version of slavery. Because slavery was known, was part of the human condition, goes back to the Garden of Eden, based on the sin of Adam and Eve and man's inhumanity to man and the disconnect between humanity and God. And so now we find whites introduced to whiteness and chattel slavery in America. Now, I'm running along through history that I want you to run with me, because I have some big ideas that I'm trying to get through in just a little while. So I'm skipping huge chunks of history, but I'm trying to lay the framework for the spiritual determinants of trauma and opioid addiction, a case for health equity and racial reconciliation. If there's a distinction between whiteness now and chattel slavery, there was an institutionalization to reinforce that bondage and that level of oppression. And not only did you find those who were enslaved dealing with their issues of trauma generationally, I will submit to you that those who came over from Europe were also experiencing trauma. Because if you can transfer trauma from one generation to the next, what do you think happened with those indentureds who came from fleeing Europe in the bondage for hundreds of years there? What do you think about those who had significant means and they were concerned about somebody rebelling? The hypersensitivity to others. If you're so concerned about what others are doing, how can you have peace? And what does that do to your ability in your mind relative to those in which you are oppressing? Ladies and gentlemen, there's a connection between those you oppress and the oppression that you also subject yourself to. Said all that to say that if you think about America and what happened after a couple of hundred years, you'll find that there was a declaration of independence between those who have gotten on their feet now and their desire to break away from the English crown. These wonderful ideas about what America or the new land should be, while at the same time enslaving and oppressing a people. Then if you run a little further, you'll find that then there was a constitutional arrangement made up by those same few individuals that the original colonists in Virginia rebelled against. And there was many debates about what should be and what shouldn't be. But the landed who had a predominant amount of influence ratified what would later become the Constitution. But when they first took it back out to the people rejected it. And then they had to come back and make modifications. Put a lot of clauses in the Constitution, and they had to reinsure that the average white could stay white and be above the indigenous and the African slave. And I don't have to tell you about what happened. You all are highly intelligent people, I could see. But you know, there was a civil war. And what was the Civil War about? Some say states' rights. Some say a lot of things. But the reality is it was about the institution of slavery and power. So much so that many men and women lost their lives, primarily men. And the majority of the ones who died did not own a slave. It divided our country then. And I submit to you that our country is divided now. Well, what was the thing that during that time period that folks had to grapple with, and what came into being to help soothe that trauma, that level of transitioning, that difference? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if somebody told you you're not who you think you are, how would you feel? What would happen to your identity if you come to believe that you're white and everything that's good is good? And now all of a sudden it's being questioned. That's enough to make you say, And you'll do things to make sure that there's cognitive homeostasis. Because anytime there is cognitive dissonance, there's an unreconciled perspective in one's mind and in one's body. And our nation continues to grapple with those ideals and its reality at the same time. But after all of the war and the fighting, there was morphine introduced. Morphine was given to soldiers, housewives, and others because not only did they have physical pain, they had emotional pain and psychological pain. The nation had an existential crisis. Who am I now? What should I do within this new place? And I will submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, we had a morphine problem. The first epidemic, I would wager, was after the Civil War, when the nation was trying to figure out who it was and who would it become. Sounds like Adam and Eve, and sounds like the issues that Cain experienced, and sounds like many of the other stories that the Bible talks about. And then the Bayer Corporation wanted to come up with something that was a little different, and it was able to isolate a molecular compound and called it heroin, and sold heroin as a better option than morphine. And then heroin became an epidemic after a while. Then, ladies and gentlemen, I'll submit to you that the second one, or epidemic, came around World War I, II, and III, Korea, up to the Vietnam War. Is when you had heroin and black tar and other types of substances flooding the American public. There's a lot happening during that time period. As I said to you, I'm jumping across significant strands of history and complexities. But you understand I don't have a lot of time to unpack all these big ideas. But suffice it to say, what was happening when the Civil War happened? How did Big Pharma introduce a substance to help regulate physical realities and psychological realities and so forth? What did the Bayer Corporation do to make up for the wayward ways of the morphine? And what was happening after the Civil War up through World War I, II, III? I mean, well, not three yet. World War I and II, Korean, and the Vietnam War. A lot of transitioning happening in our country, much like the Civil War. Racial strife and downturns in the economy, the haves and the have-nots. And every time, ladies and gentlemen, we have those challenges, you'll find an uptick in substance abuse and misuse, and you'll have an uptick in racial hostility. And the last epidemic that I would say, many more, but let me just say that in the 1990s, what was happening? Very similar story. You had pharmaceutical companies saying that the doctors who were not prescribing pain medicines were evil because they were not dealing with significant pain. And then they had all kinds of marketing ploys and other types of things to justify the wholesale production and distribution of Oxycontin, other forms of opioids. They were lying to the general public about the ramifications of those toxic drugs. And yes, pain is real and many people are experiencing it. But those big pharma companies also had excellent lobbyists. You had major challenges amongst the American people, vying for identity and other types of things. And it was a quiet storm that pervaded America. And now we have modern day opioid crisis. But what happened to the crack cocaine crisis? What happened to the methamphetamine issue? What happened to the tobacco issue? What happened to the alcohol issue? You name the substance that one could become addicted to and misuse. It was also happening in America. But ladies and gentlemen, I'll submit to you that while opioids affects us all, it also disproportionately affects those who are Black and brown. Oftentimes it's said that if America catches a cold, then African Americans and indigenous populations, they'll catch the flu. And how many know that there was also a time in which there was dog whistles that played on the fears of the American people to justify all manner of things and all manner of draconian public policies, to substantiate and justify why you had disproportionate amounts of people ostracized and in prison, feeling left out, lost. Because if you go back to what I said to you regarding the early 1600s in Virginia, And if you think about what I said about Adam and Eve and Cain and all the rest of the biblical stories, and if you think about man's inhumanity to man, no matter wherever you find man, you've got to ask the question, why is it the case? Why is it that we will create unjust laws? Why is it that we will allow people to go hungry at night? Why is it that we will deny health care to those who need it? Why is it that we would murder people just because? Why would we hate another individual because of the color of their skin? Why can't we live up to our ideals as a nation? Those are fundamental questions. And I submit to you, we can't because we are still disconnected from God. I'm not talking about religion, because you know what religion has done. You know what it has done to you and what it's done and justified historically. I'm talking about what God created in the beginning. Ecosystems, one with nature, communing with God, been submitted and doing his will, doing the gift, utilizing the gifts and purposes for which God has given you according to his likeness and his glory. Because, ladies and gentlemen, each of you would have a specific set of gifts and talents that God sent you here to deploy. And only you can deploy that gift and those talents. The world is waiting on you. But if we continue to be isolated and bogged down by perceived differences, you could imagine what we'll continue to get. Albert Einstein put it this way. He said, you can never solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it. You can never solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it. And when you think about America, we try to solve a set of complex problems within the box that created the problem, and wonder why Republicans can't get along with Democrats, why whites can't get along with blacks and indigenous, and everything in between, and how we can see harm and people going through, but we turn our faces and our gazes. And then we make it very personal. I'm not like them, but yet we benefit from them, and our complacency reinforces the continuance of what we're dealing with. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, we have spiritual determinants that are rooted in trauma. And everywhere you find human beings, you'll find problems. Because there's also a biological root to it. God created a fight, flight, and freeze. Every time that we as human beings get a little anxious, that means our body is getting ready to ward off a threat. But what if I told you that I'm your threat? What would you do? Your body will naturally create adrenaline, and it will make your heart beat fast. The more adrenaline that you have in your body, it also is associated with cortisol. High adrenaline, high cortisol. You know that's correlated with high blood pressure, kidney disease. and your natural tendency to try to react and don't even know why. Because, ladies and gentlemen, most of our behavior happens at the subconscious level, not at the conscious level. This is why you can know good and know right from wrong and still do wrong. Because what's on your mental subconscious tape? What's on the world's subconscious tape? What's on the American people's subconscious tape? If you think about all of the myths and pseudoscience regarding all manner of things, you would have to bear witness that a lot of what's playing on our tapes are not rooted in God and is not rooted in science. Ladies and gentlemen, race is not real, but racism is. Racism created race and a pseudoscience to justify it. Why? Because of greed, because of the need to subjugate others, to justify the greed, and to keep one fighting against another. God has created enough for everybody. But why is it that some are concerned and afraid that if you open the tent, there won't be enough for them? And how much do they need? How much money do they need to make? How many cars can you drive? How many houses can you live in? How many names can you call? You feel better about putting another down? Because that's the lie that was told in the 1600s. Because that's when whites became white in America. And I've said to you that even though you may be white and others may be whatever group that they consider themselves as, we're all dealing with trauma. And when you got hurt people interacting with hurt people, what do you get? More hurt people. And then you got to find a way to attribute problems associated with them. And then you make your issue not something that you did, it's other people's that caused you to have your problem. That's attribution error. There's something wrong with them if they can't figure it out. But when it happens to you, oh, somebody's doing it to you. This thing about how we deal with the opioid crisis in America. Look at how politicians demonize crack cocaine. Look at all the other drug policies that were implemented and the desperate outcomes associated with those negative policies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those policies are all a form of control. I'm not saying that everybody who's indulging shouldn't go to jail. Some people need to go to jail. I'm not saying all pharmaceutical companies are bad. Many of them doing wonderful things. I'm not saying all Americans are greedy, because they're not. But there are too many other people in our nation that are not doing what they should be doing in order to get to that critical tipping point, to make our nation become what we all envision it to be. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as I come to a close, and I will take a few questions, if we don't create a beloved society, and if we don't become what we profess and put on paper, we'll be a nation at risk. And every other nation, I would say, they're looking There's no other nation that is as strong as America militarily. And when you think about ancient Greece, Samaria, Kemet or Egypt, Rome, all of them declined because of the people rotted from within. It weakened the nation internally, and it allowed an external enemy to move in and take over. And I will submit to you again, ladies and gentlemen, if we continue to do and run the race that we've been running as a nation, there are other nations that are salivating and chomping at the bits. America will be like Rome. It'll crumble from within. And anytime you have majority of Americans that are fighting for crumbs, fighting for jobs, fighting for health care, you'll find a nation at risk. So it behooves us to figure out what we can do together, how we can channel the best of us with the greatest ideals of America, to not function within the box, but to transcend the box. Because as I said to you, ladies and gentlemen, if I come at this as a Republican or a Democrat and you come at it that way, or white and black, and everybody got their ism on the table, all we'll keep doing is the same old thing. And if we've had opioid crisis before, as soon as we remedy this one, guess what'll happen? We'll have another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. So as I close, I believe that the best of America is to come. And I can't think of a greater place to live and to raise a family. With all America's fault, she still allowed a boy from Charlotte, North Carolina, to go to some of the most amazing colleges and universities, to stand before you tonight, to say what I'm saying without being concerned about being arrested. I got on a plane to fly here, and all they wanted was my identification. I'm gonna talk to my lovely wife and 4 children once I leave here, without being concerned about my calls being tapped or interrupted. Ladies and gentlemen, we still live in the greatest nation. But the question is, when will the solid majority, shoulder to shoulder, to say enough is enough? I am my brother's keeper. We don't have to always get along, but I am my brother's keeper. And when I see somebody doing something wrong or unjust, I'm going to speak about it. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to vote about it. And you do it within the gifts and talents that you have. Everybody can't march. Some people can write. Some people can paint. Some people can do public policy. Some people can be good and excellent clinicians. Some people can teach and preach. Some people good with cameras and all other types of technologies. Some people may be outstanding businessmen and women. What do you do with the gifts and talents you have to make the world a better place? How do you transform and transcend the isms, the limitations of your own minds? Because the solution is also in the problem. If the problem is man's sin from God, then the solution is adjusting back to the creator of the heavens and the earth, who created the initial ecosystems and subsystems, who formed our bodies, who gave us gifts and talents to be used for his glory in the betterment of mankind. I'm not talking about religion, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking about the God that created everything. It's about us having a personal relationship with God and seeing ourselves in our fellow man, woman, and child. Because we share most of the same DNA. What makes us different is our perception of ourselves. So I submit to you, it's what we do for the least and the lost that really makes a difference. Because we're all going to leave here, ladies and gentlemen. We are not born to live forever in these physical mortal bodies. But the question is, how will your generation and how will your lineage say that you fought the good fight? You made a difference. And you've dealt with your own trauma to set your own generations free. That's the question that I hope that you would contemplate as we go into questions and answers. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll take a few questions. Should anybody?
Dr. Sizer, I have a microphone here, so let me give this to you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really powerful
Thank you.
going through all of that. One of the things that was coming together in my mind as you were talking, and I wanted to see if you knew if there was evidence for this or what your thoughts were when you mentioned about how in America, if there's a cold going around and white people are getting a cold, then people of color are usually going to be getting a flu. Do you think is there a correlation with that between epigenetics and chattel slavery and people of color maybe being in a higher state of cortisol and adrenaline all the time because of potentially fear and epigenetics going, back to slavery and that affecting, responses to viruses and such?
Yes, the answer is yes. But I would also submit to you that African Americans are not the only ones that are dealing with epigenetic trauma factors.
Yeah.
And all of us are experiencing those epigenetic factors. And epigenetics are not always bad. We can inherit a lot of wonderful things. Because what epigenetics are also related with, it's like a tag relative to our DNA. It can turn on good things. It could also turn on bad things. And we could also transmit from generation to generation good things and bad things. Relative to African Americans, for example, there's a lot of high blood pressure, diabetes, and hypertension, and all these other types of chronic and other related health diseases. There's also a lot of stress based on dealing with living in America and all the other social factors that communities are having to juxtapose and juggle. But that's not to say that only African Americans are dealing with that. There are other groups that are also dealing with something similar. But based on disparities and based on the science, we do find that communities that have historically been left out of health and human services, that would have undergone significant public policies that created disparities. And when you think about how at least 60 to 80% of what weakens the body or sends people into healthcare related facilities or hospitals, a lot of that's primarily driven by social factors like those environmental circumstances like housing, school, and other opportunities. You'll find that anywhere you find those types of challenges, you'll find high occurrences of people who are experiencing a lot of maladies and other types of issues.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any additional questions?
My wife beat me to it actually, but thank you so much. This was amazing. I'm sitting here blown away right now. How do you keep the main thing the main thing? So my wife and we do inner city mission work and have for over a decade. We're both, anti-racist and very active in reconciliation. And then, you mentioned everything you said tonight, which was so powerful about, just the spiritual determinants to things. And you see that, but then there is actual public policy that's wrong. Okay. I don't think it's the answer. I think the answer is the spiritual side of things. But when you see some laws that are coming up that I hate to waste time to fight them, but they're just wrong. They're just not going to work. They're going to make matters worse, but it's still not the answer. The answer is still the spiritual determinants to it all. It's the fallen nature of us as human beings. How do you keep the main thing the main thing?
That's a great question. How I do it, then I'll respond to your question. I recognize that I'm going to die. I only have so much time. And I recognize what my purpose is and what my gifts and talents are. And they come from my pain. The stuff that keeps me up at night is what I led with. Regarding you and your wife, let me commend you, because your work is not easy. But I would challenge you to be as authentic as possible. Say what you do know and say what you don't know. And walk within your gifts and your talents based on the people that God has called you to. And you can't fight every battle, but you can fight the battles that you're called to. And that's where you'll find your greatest joy, peace, and impact. And you have to be okay with that. And you have to be okay with people that you're trying to help may not understand and may call you something else, and those who in your own peer group or so-called racial group might have issues and concerns with that. But you just have to know that what you're doing, you're making a difference because you're using your gifts and talents to make that difference. And whatever your tribe is that God created before you were created in your mother's womb, he'll send them to you as long as you're true and faithful. And so stay encouraged and do the things in which you're called to do as authentically as possible. And you'll make that difference within the people that God will send you to help with. I'll take any more if you have them.
Thank you. I don't know if I necessarily have a question, but I think I do. I think that your presentation was courageous. And I'm saying that because I'm the only African American in this room that I know of that registered for this conference. And my challenge is an awareness that what slavery did to people of color, there was also a spiritual determinant for white people as well. But I've choose to live my life not in this space of bitterness or anger or blame, but I'm solution oriented because I'm a preacher's kid, a preacher, and also a member of Narcotics Anonymous. So my challenge in spaces like these is to be as courageous, to be fearless and willing to walk alone if I have to. However, grateful for the allies who show themselves. What words of wisdom do you have for me?
Well, let me first of all say that let me validate your willingness, because it takes a willing soul to stand and be all that God would have called you to be. But it's also freeing when you're comfortable in your own skin, when you walk in authenticity and you walk in purpose. Because what that does is it roots out blame. It meets us at a level of humanity. I recognize all the issues in the public policies. I get it. But if I only operate within that box, you know what I'm gonna get? The same old thing. We've got to find a way to take all of our differences in America and not move from it, but meld into those ideals. This is why I still have hope. Because America has always remade itself over and over and over again. The problem is, as I see it, is that we are all battling with our own trauma. The white, the black, the native, you name it. And all of us are complicitous. This is why led with no matter where you find human beings, you find a similar set of problems. And I challenge anybody to find where that's not the case. What makes our issue in America different is that we made it chattel. And we created all these other policies and other types of perceptions and pseudosciences to justify all the things that we got. And then we continue to blame others. And when others start to look at and challenge it, you've got people who got this other perception on their subconscious tape, and they start getting defensive and they start getting anxious and they start getting all these other things, and they fight against it, even though they know it's right. So it takes courageous souls to be free in truth, not in blame. Because I acknowledge my own issues and I acknowledge my own complicities. I've got a retirement account. My retirement account is connected with every other person with a retirement account. Those retirement accounts are connected with every big business in America. I went and got some gas before I got on the plane. I went to Exxon. So how can I be against corporate entities when my retirement is associated with corporate interests? I worked for the government, and yet the government was a main problem in historically creating issues and challenges for all kinds of people. What am I saying? Things that are good can be bad, and things that are bad can become good. We just have to have the right perspective on that thing. So stay in the fight, stay courageous, and be free, and be okay with being free. Be okay with being free.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for sharing your hope, your continued hope. I'm going to try not to cry.
You can cry.
Someday,
You can cry.
Sometimes it's hard to keep that hope. My question is, in the US, in 2022, do you have could you give a few concrete examples of what steps or actions to take that would help us step out of that box to start solving at both a macro and micro level? Some of that micro stuff, it's going to be who our particular gifts and talents and who we are, where we're at in the city or town or area we live in. But could you share just a couple concrete macro and maybe micro ways to step out of that box? Because the fire is lit. So how do we help ourselves and our communities and our nation do that standing to shoulder to shoulder?
Yes,
How do we do that?
that's an excellent question. And I couldn't think of a better question to close with, because that's how I began. I talked about our humanity and commonality. We are created by one God. We're created out of the same ecosystems. The same stuff that created me created you. The same one who created everything created all of us. So it comes with an acknowledgement of who our creator is. Number two, being able to see another without making them an other. See them as yourself. See them as struggling with some of the same issues and problems, because as I said, man's inhumanity to man. And wherever you find people, you'll find problems. So it can't just be only white people with problems. What about the Arabs? What about the Africans? What about the Chinese? What about the indigenous people? You mean to tell me they didn't commit trauma? They didn't do any enslavement? They didn't hurt other families? They didn't have fears and anxieties and worries? As human beings, we have those things. I'm not going to empower one and then disempower another. We all are dealing with issues of trauma. Now, I recognize that there's an organization of systemic policies and other social realities and fabrications that's in our minds. It's also in our bodies. Because sometimes we act out of our bodies and our trauma without even thinking about it. Because we've been so programmed. And we've been so programmed for generation after generation after generation. Think about all the stuff that you know that you experienced in your family. Think about your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and issues that you know they did and didn't do. And how you would be ashamed if everybody knew some of the stuff that went on in your family. And how you feel when somebody tells you that you're the problem when you're trying to help. It makes that tape that all of us have playing augmented, and some of us will naturally respond from our own traumas, our own fears, our anxieties, because our bodies will seek to go back to a state where we're comfortable with, no matter if it's good or bad. Because I started with our God created systems and subsystems. And where does those systems also live? Within your bodies. So the issues out here also germinate from within and goes out. So when you see reality and all the things that we see and living in America, just know that it comes from inside out. Everything we see external is a manifestation of internal dispositions, codified by law and social norms, public policies and relationships and misperceptions and so forth, and pseudosciences. We are maintaining the problems that we say we don't want to have. So again, I would say to you that when you think about hurricanes in Florida, allegedly you had senators who voted against FEMA, supporting FEMA. And guess what those senators did when Ian hit? They went and made sure FEMA settled up. And guess what the governor did? He wrote to the president to say he's declaring a disaster so that the federal government can send resources to help out Americans. It's an example. When we are all hurting, when it's something perceived to not be something that we did, we will bypass that negative tape to some conscious level and say, let's go help because it's unwarranted. Nobody's concerned about Republicans and Democrats in Florida. People are concerned about people getting help. The problem will come in is that once some people get help, they will forget about others who need help. Because there was a disaster before Ian hit. For too many across our nation, for too many communities. And we ought to see broken communities and people as hurricanes. And if we did that, ladies and gentlemen, we'd be much better off. And we've got to then think about if we don't do what we profess we are, we will become a nation at risk, and we will be fighting against a foreign nation who will eventually overtake us. If that ain't enough, we will go the way of Rome, Samaria, Mesopotamia, and all the rest of the nations. America is not going to be here forever. if America fails to continue to live up to what it professes. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I believe in one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty, justice, and yes, healthcare, housing, education, and opportunities for all.